So today we're going to be talking a little bit about honey. And one of the most common questions we've had since the beginning is candied honey going to be a problem in my flow frames? And that's a fair enough question. And the answer is we don't really see that as a problem in the world. We've got 75,000 flow hives in 130 different countries, and we get the question a lot, but we don't see people having issues with candied honey in their flow frames. So that's the short answer. Now I'm going to explain a little bit about honey and why that may be the case. So if you have a look at these honeys here, the other thing that happens to people often if they're new to honey and they're used to buying honey off the supermarket shelves and they're used to it always looking like this, the reason why it always looks like this on the supermarket shelf is they pasteurize it, they heat it to a point where the honey will never go crystallized again. And while that makes for a homogeneous product that always looks the same on the shelf, it destroys much of the good properties of honey. So much better off keeping your honey raw, and that does mean it will go candied like this eventually. Now, all honey will go candied eventually, and it's just about when it will go candied. Now, in the Egyptian tombs, they found honey 3,000 years old that is still good. So it will keep a long time, but it will go candied. Now, it's not a bad thing. In fact, it can be a delicious thing. In here you can see it's got that beautiful crystallized texture. And in fact, many beekeepers strive for a beautiful candy, especially if they're in a colder region where honey is going to candy. They'll often seed the honey with a little bit of candied honey so it takes on that crystalline structure to get a nice smooth candy in the jar. My kids were actually fighting over the candied honey this morning. My little daughter Mella, who's 2, was calling it crispy honey. She's like, I want the crispy honey, and my boy Charlie's going, no, I want the crispy honey, and they were squabbling over the candied honey. So it is a beautiful thing. You hear stories of people throwing out honey because it went off, and you go, went off? How did it go off? And they said, oh, well, it went all like hard in the jar. You're like, oh, actually, that's a good thing, because that means the honey is raw. It's still got its beautiful medicinal properties, and it hasn't been heat treated. So if it goes candied, it's a good sign that it's been extracted in a way and hasn't been heat treated. Now, it's also beautiful to have the liquid honey. So what I like is variations. You have dark honeys on the shelf, you have light honeys on the shelf, you have candied honeys, and people can enjoy all the flavors and colors of all of those. We're also going to harvest a bit of honey. If you've got questions, put it in the comments below. But the reason why honey goes candied sometimes and not others is the ratios of sugars. There's about 4 different sugars in here, and it's the ratio of sugars of glucose and sucrose, and depending on what ratio it is will depend on how early it will candy. And the other thing is, if it's cold, it'll candy more quickly. Those sugar crystals will form more quickly. So some flowers, like the paperbark we have down here, can candy in the hive. However, it's unusual. It usually candies soon after you've extracted it. And the reason why that is your bees are keeping the honey warm. When the honey's warm, it's less likely to crystallize and it will still flow out. You could get into the situation where if you're in a cold climate and you've left the honey on for a long time and the snow's starting and you go to harvest and the honey's gone candied. We don't hear about it very often, but I guess that could happen, in which case you probably should leave that honey for the bees anyway. So at worst, just like any form of extracting honey, if the honey does go candied in the hive, just leave it for the bees. They'll chew it out and replace it with liquid honey again when they get around to consuming that honey. We have done experiments getting a candied honey frame, putting it in the hive. So we've taken it out of the hive, kept it in the fridge till it's gone candied, and put it back in the hive and just experimented to see what will happen. And what did happen is the honey didn't really flow out. A little bit of honey flowed out in an area where it wasn't very candied, and the remainder stayed in the frame. But because the parts we're trying to removed, the bees detected that disturbance, and that prompted them to eat that honey out and fix the frame. So in a way, you attempting to harvest candied honey, if that was to happen to you, will prompt the bees to chew it out and replace it with liquid honey again. So we haven't really seen it as a problem, and I think that's why, is it stays warm on the hive, it doesn't candy very often, and when it does, you've usually got some liquid honey in the centre to harvest and bring to your table anyway. If you've got questions, put it in the comments below, and Trace, who you might recognise her voice if you've phoned up Flow Hive, she will answer the questions. She'll read out your questions and we'll answer them. At the same time, we're going to just harvest a little bit of honey. Now, if you look at this hive, there's not a whole lot of honey going on at the moment. If you look in this window, you do see some capped honey. So we know there's honey in here. We know there's honey in the hive, but because I'm not seeing any cells full at the back here, I'm just going to harvest a little bit of honey, which is one thing you can do with the Flow Hive, is just take a small amount, as much as you need for your family, and leave the rest for the bees if they're not bringing in lots of honey at the time. So looking in the windows, you can gauge what's going on. You can see last week we actually had some cells filling, and this week they're disappeared again. So that shows that the bees have actually been finding less nectar this week than last week. However, if you want to harvest a small amount, let's say a jar, you get say 6 or 7 of these per frame. So if you just put the key in a little ways, you could harvest just a section of the frame like this. So if I turn this now, then we should see honey starting to flow just out of that end cell. In fact, maybe what I should do is go a little bit further so that you can see the difference in the side of when it gets harvested and when it doesn't. Okay, while we're waiting, it's a pretty cold morning. It's been a cold night here, so it will flow slower than when it's nice and warm. So you should expect to see honey coming eventually. Okay, any questions, put it in the comments below and we'll get to answering those. And fantastic, we've got a few coming in.
Yep, there's, hello everyone. There's a lot of love being shared today on the Flow Hive, so that's pretty awesome. But one of the questions, Cedar, is from Ted Watts. He's in Sydney. He wants to know, sometimes the honey in his Flow Hive goes a little bit candy, and can this be fixed, and is it a problem?
Okay, so we just talked all about that. So if the honey candies inside the hive, which is something that we don't get reports of very often, then you'll find it will flow out if it's partially candied. So like you'll get just a cloudy honey coming out, and that's not a problem, still comes out. Honey goes candied eventually anyway. If you find that some of the edge frames, because they're cooler, are getting nice, actually candying and the honey's not coming out, then what you'll find is your attempt to open those cells will actually disturb the comb a little bit, enough for the bees to go, we're going to chew that all away, take out all of the candied honey and replace it with liquid again, and hopefully next time you'll get more honey. If you have a look in this window here, you'll see there's not a whole lot of honey going on at the moment. They've eaten the honey out of this frame. Okay, keep the questions coming.
Oh, great. So there's a lot of people saying that candied honey is their favourite, so that's pretty good. A lot of people are saying if they extract, Sean Malloy, he's extracted honey out of his Flow Hive, and there was about 20% water in it. How long do you think that honey will last?
Okay, so 20% is right on the threshold. If you're above 20%, and some beekeepers like to keep it more like at 18%. If you're above 20%, and it depends on how many colony forming units of yeast there are in the honey as to when and if fermentation might start to occur. So the less water content, the less likely it is to ferment. However, it's around that mark where honey will start to ferment. So you may want to keep that honey in the fridge or consume it before fermentation starts. Or you could turn it into honey mead, which is another lovely thing to do.
Fantastic. Another one, Cedar, is how can you spot robber honeys? One of our customers have said that they were harvesting and there were some really dark bees, and they were like, oh, they didn't look like their bees. So would they have been robber bees?
The answer is probably not. The bees can have multiple genetic materials from multiple fathers in the hive. Because the bee goes out on a mating flight and might mate with 30 drones, then you will often see different bees in your hive, some dark ones, some light ones, etc. However, as you say, bees will come if they're hungry to honey jars. So if we find the bees are coming to the jar, then we should cover that up so the bees aren't getting in the jar. The way to tell whether bees are robber bees or not is their behaviour. So if you look at bees and they're coming all around the back here and trying to get in every nook and cranny of the hive and kind of moving erratically, they're robber bees. And if you see that happening, then there's a few things you want to do. Is make sure there's no honey available for robber bees to suck up, and also make sure your hives aren't being robbed out. And sometimes if there's a lot of activity, you'll see fighting at the entrance, in which case you need to close down your entrance. You can even just poke some grass or garden mulch in the front and just close it right up till it's just a gap big enough for a bee to get out, and then your colonies will then be able to defend themselves more easily against those robbers. So, good question.
Good question. There's actually a lot of questions coming that really they should be calling me on customer support. So
yeah.
Ring me about those ones.
Okay.
If you're wanting to know when your flow hives are going to arrive, ring our beautiful customer support team.
Well, that is the thing actually, and perhaps we should talk about that. It's with so many people at home and so many people enjoying gardening and wanting projects with their families, we've actually been struggling to make hives quick enough. It's amazing to have so many orders from all around the world, and we're running a 24/7 production line here in Australia to keep up and make sure we're getting the hives to you. So we're trying our best, but I guess we didn't expect so many orders at this time. So we're busy making in our factory locally here in Australia. We're Australian made, and we've also got hives on the water on the way to the USA as well. So thanks for waiting patiently, and I hope your hive arrives for you soon.
Thanks, Cedar. There's a few people wanting to know. They can see that jar of honey on top of the hive. They're wondering what makes that so dark.
So that's the flowers. So which flowers the bees forage on will determine the colour of the honey, and it's extraordinary. Out of one frame you get one colour of honey, and out of another frame you get another. So it's beautiful to isolate frame by frame the different colours of honey and the different flavours, and then it's a joy to share that. But it's basically the flowers they went to. So these are the tones we get in the winter of the Banksias in the heathland down here, and these are the tones we get more in the springtime, where you've got things like the ironbarks flowering and a whole lot of other species that produce lighter coloured nectar. Okay, keep the questions coming.
Another one, Ava's wanting to know, how big a space do you need to have your flow hive in your garden?
Okay, so the flow hive is quite neat. As far as farming goes, it takes up a very small amount of space. And so you only need this amount of space for your flow hive, but you do need flowers for the bees to forage on. And the bees will fly 6 miles, 10 kilometres to get flowers if they're hungry. And in a city, even in an urban backyard, people produce amazing honeys, and some argue that even more varieties and amazing honey they're getting out of the city than they are out of their farmland, because people plant all sorts of things in their garden and the bees go out and forage on those things, and in the parklands in those cities. And there's often a longer season in the cities as well. So you get people keeping flow hives on balconies, in backyards, on rooftops. So it's not so much about the space, it's about the situation of the hive and making sure where the bees are setting up their flight path, which is at the front side of the hive, that they have enough space to not bother anybody. You don't want the bees coming straight out of the entrance and right to where people or your neighbours might be walking, for instance. We've got videos on situating your flow hive to help you decide on where you want to put it. My sister's been keeping flow hives in Berlin on her balcony, and she's got some great pictures of that, which is pretty cool.
Gee, we're getting a few of our Australian customers, of course, trying to get their hives up and running again after the bushfires, and just wondering if there's anything they can do to sort of encourage the bees after these massive fires we've had in Australia.
Yes, wow, it feels like a lifetime ago already with all the events that have been happening in the globe since then, but the bushfires were an intense thing in Australia, and it's so glad that the rains have come and the seasons have changed and we're not out there fighting fires. Stone behind the camera and myself and many others from the office were out there fighting fires as well, and it was really an intense time, but the ramifications of that are loss of habitat, as you say. So there's many species that will take a while to bounce back. Generally, I've found when fires go through, it's the season after that really goes boom with a lot of flowers. So you might have to wait patiently. If your bees are hungry, then you're going to want to feed them. You don't want them starving, but if they are collecting some pollen and some nectar, then it might just be a case of they're collecting enough to survive, but not enough to really store a lot of honey for your family. So look at that, the honey's moving incredibly slow this morning. As said, we're harvesting the edge frame. It was a very cold night here last night, so when it's cold it just goes slower, so which just means you can go and make yourself a cup of tea while the honey comes out.
Practice a bit of patience. See, to David Stowe, he's got 2 flow hives. One won't take to the flow frames, and he's just wondering, would he be able to swap 3 of his established frames from one hive and swap them to the other?
The answer is yes, you can by all means do that, bearing in mind that when you swap equipment from one hive to the other, you are sharing pathogens from one to the other. So that's a risk you take, but it is something that people do in beekeeping to solve other problems they're trying to solve. So certainly people do that, and it will get the bees up there sooner. But basically the recipe to get a lot of activity on your flow frames is lots of bees. When you open the window, you want to see lots of bees like that, and coinciding with the nectar flow. If those 2 things don't happen, it will be quite slow and you'll just be waiting. One thing I do, not very often, I usually do nothing, put the frames in, the bees get up there and do their thing, but as some people do, and it's not so much painting wax on the frames, some people do that, but that's a lot more effort, is just scrape some burr comb off the brood frames underneath when you put your super on, and just mash that into the flow frame surface. You won't damage the flow frames, and the bees will go, hang on a minute, that's not supposed to be there, and quite quickly they'll redistribute that wax in that area on the flow frames, and you'll start to see some faster action if you're getting impatient waiting for your bees. Now, if you do it on the edge window, it can be nice to watch that happen. So there's a tip there if you want to speed up that process. It's quite a light honey coming in today, which is nice. Oh, my sister's going to want some of this honey. It's her favourite. We call it the Butterscotch Honey. I haven't connected it to which flower it is, but it is amazing. It's like, can't describe it. It's like this beautiful butterscotch flavour. So that's nice. It doesn't come around very often, and it's exciting when it comes.
Right. Cedar, Brian wants to know, is losing bees during the winter normal, and if so, what causes it and what can be done to minimise the loss?
Okay, so that depends on what region you're in. Most bee books are written for places that have really long cold winters. If you're in an area like us in a subtropical region, then bees actually do quite well over winter and bring in more honey in the winter than in autumn, so it really depends where you are in the world. However, if you're in a cold climate that has many months of cold and snow and so on, then losing bees during winter is quite normal. What happens is your colony is trying to survive that time. They build stores so they can last through that long cold time without being able to forage and collect nectar and pollen. And there's multiple reasons why it could happen, and but one of them is they simply run out of food. And so how you can prevent that is make sure they've got enough stores before that long cold winter comes. In some places you want a full box of honey for them to consume during that winter time, and in really extreme places you might need 2 boxes of honey for the bees to consume during that long cold winter. Depends on the size of the colony you're keeping as well. A larger colony will need more honey to consume to survive that time. The bees, they do something called instead of normal workers, they make what's called fat bees, which is bees that have a bit more body mass and are built to last longer. So while foragers in the summertime might only last 4 or 6 weeks, the fat bees could last 6 months, and that helps the colony through those cold times. And that's the natural cycle of the bees. They have evolved in really cold times, cold areas, so they are used to long cold winters, but making sure they've got enough food to survive is the number one key thing. There are many other factors as well, like pests as well, so ask your local beekeepers, try and get some help on how to get hives through winter if it's becoming challenging.
Oh, I love the sound of those fat bees, Cedar. I think that'll be us after COVID-19.
Sitting at home eating too much honey.
Too much honey. Chelsea, she notices that there's pollen and wax on our viewing windows. She's just wondering, do the bees ever try to cover the windows with comb?
Look, it can happen, but it's very hive specific, and sometimes you will get a bit of comb on the window, more so in the hybrid hives where you've got a bit more space between the comb and the clear glass here. So I've tried to space it, and after many years of messing around, we've tried to space it so the bees won't actually build comb, because the bees are trying to get to a situation where they've got 9 millimeters back-to-back working area in the hive, but on the edge 6 millimeters, because they're only working a comb against a wall. So, but then again, you do want the bees to build their capping out a little bit from the comb. So if you make too much space on the edge, the bees will tend to build more comb on the edge as they go towards the wall. Depends on your bees, of course, but it's not really a problem. It's just something that bees do, and it's a perfectly natural thing, and it's beautiful to look at some random comb as well, as long as you can still service your hive and get your frames out from time to time.
Now we've got to do a big shout out here because we've just had Camilla come in from Uruguay, and she used to work in our factory.
Hey Camilla!
And she's setting up her fly hive this week, and she's very excited. And she's
good.
We've got a shout out to her. I remember her from the factory. Awesome, we miss you.
Fantastic. I want to hear all about how the honey is when it comes in.
Exactly, in Uruguay.
Good season ahead of you too, so great, a good time to be setting up your hive. Nice to hear from you.
Yeah. Anthea, how long does it take for bees to reorientate after moving your hive 30 kilometres?
Okay, they orientate really quickly, and it's quite surprising. So you've closed up your hive in the evening, you've stuck it on the back of your pickup, and you've taken it 30 kilometres, put your hive down again, you've opened up the entrance, and the bees are boom, out. Hang on, everything looks different. And bees have somehow amazing memory for the landscape. You think a little insect this big, how could it do it? But they have amazing memories, and they really know where their location is very specifically. And what you'll find is when you put it there and you open up the entrance, the bees will be quite confused for a while. They'll fly out and go, hang on, this looks really different. You'll notice them just flying around in a kind of a random patterns and then coming back into the hive, and that's them orientating. And within a number of hours, a lot of those foragers will have relocated to the new spot. So really quite quickly. And they'll be heading off on journeys looking for nectar and pollen sources.
Kamal is asking, did the bees ever get caught in the frames when you open up the frames to get the honey out?
Okay, so that was something we worked hard at for many years. And what we've done in the flow frames, if you have a close look at them, is made it so that if you've harvested when bees are down the cells, let's say the honey wasn't ready or the bees had chewed out an area and there was bees working those parts when you were harvesting that frame, then rather than have the parts meeting like this, which was some of our early designs, which could on closure catch a bee's leg or wing like that, we made a space like this on a bit of a V angle. And what that does is it means that the bees need to connect the wax across those areas. When the parts move like that, then back again, there's this gap here. And at worst, the bee could just get stuck in wax, which it can get out of, or the other bees will help it out of. But generally no, and we put a lot of effort into making sure the bees were okay, even if they're down the frames, down the cells in the frames.
Michelle's wondering, can she see some drone comb on the right side of the window?
Okay, that's a good observation, and you're obviously tuned in with cell sizes and spend a lot of time with bees to notice that. And the answer is they are close to drone size. These are the flow frame cells, so we hope there's no eggs being laid and the excluder's in place to stop that. But what we did is we sized it just underneath drone size. So for some hives you can run without an excluder and the bees won't lay drones or workers in these cells. So that was something we tried to do. However, because bees will be bees, it's quite queen specific. So I've got a hive right outside my door that I don't use an excluder, which is the grid to stop the queen getting up, and she will never lay in the flow frames, but other colonies definitely will. So it's something you can experiment with, but getting back, yes, they're close to drone frame size cells.
Do you leave any full frame cedar in the hive when you're harvesting, or do you like to empty them all?
I just like to harvest a couple of frames, because a whole frame will be 6 to 8 jars this size, so that's plenty of honey. So it really depends what you're trying to do. I generally just harvest a few frames and go, wow, that's a beautiful amount of honey, and take that back to the house. But other people's strategies, and especially beekeepers that are used to conventional beekeeping, because it was so much work to open up the hive and take all the honey, you may as well take it all when you were doing it. So people that have come from beekeeping generally harvest it all at once, and people that are new to beekeeping and have our flow hives generally harvest a few frames and go, wow, that's amazing, and leave the rest for the bees at the time. I think it's less of a disturbance to the bees to harvest just a couple of frames. The bees use the honey as thermal mass, and it's also more efficient to say do every second frame than it is to do the whole lot, because the bees will clean up all the drips from all the leftover bit of honey in this frame, and they'll transfer it to the next one, which might not be quite finished filling yet. So I tend to harvest just a few frames or every second one.
Right, and do you know, Brandon wants to know, I think maybe he's in Australia, he wants to know, do any native wildlife like to eat our bees, apart from, of course, our cane toads.
Well, I was going to say our cane toads, they're not native, but they're a bit of a
No.
menace, and you'll find a few around here in the garden, and at night time they'll bang on a hive, wait for the bees to come out, then eat them. Once I had a hive that was not doing so well. It was just a conventional hive many years ago, and I picked it up to move it over, and the bottom dropped off, and inside was a big cane toad, like this big, and there was clearly no way it was ever going to get out the entrance again. So I imagine it went in when it was small, and it was living inside the hive, eating bees. Imagine that, you're flying home as a bee, you're coming in the entrance, and you've got to get past this big monster with a big licking tongue to try and get into the hive. So there's those cane toads. We also have water dragons, which are native here, which they'll eat a few bees. We have the pheasants, which are a big bird, the pheasant cuckoo. We have the rainbow bee eaters, and we once showed some video of them coming here a certain time of year. They come in and they like to fly around and eat bees. I kind of think fair's fair for the most part, but if you have a problem where a lot of your bees are getting eaten, then you need to do something about that. And it's why we have a stand on the hive. It's to get it up off the ground and away from the cane toads and water dragons and things that are down at ground level. In other countries you've got skunks, you've got all sorts of things, and I'm glad we don't have bears here, because having bears to rip apart your hive would not be fun.
Sita, this is a question, and it's interesting because it's a common one I get on the phones actually, and people often think it's a really stupid question, but they want to know, like, how do you get bees in the hive, and will the bees just fly in all by themselves?
Okay, there's no such thing as a silly question, and of course we all started off as new beekeepers once, and the answer is no. The bees will actually, it's not completely no, it's very rarely will you set up your hive empty and the bees will just come and populate it. So the way you get started is you go to a bee breeder and you ask for a nucleus, and that's an already going hive. You get in your bee suit and your smoker, you transfer them into your bottom box and put the other frames in there as well. Look after your bees and they'll grow from there. You can also order a package in the mail, which is a whole lot of bees just shaken off frames into a box, and they will put a queen in there as well in a little cage. You can shake the bees into your hive and put the queen in. They can also start like that. Another way is catching a swarm, which is more adventurous, and we've got plenty of videos showing you how to do that. And if you've got a friend with bees, then you could also take a split from their hive. So you come over to another hive, you take some of the brood frames out. You can either order in a special queen if you want those genetics, or if there's eggs on those frames, they'll raise a queen for themselves. So there's 4 main ways. But as to will they come to an empty hive, the answer is sometimes, and that's called a bait hive. And beekeepers will set up bait hives around other hives. So if you've got an apiary like this, it could be a good idea to set up bait hives around that. And 6 to 12 feet off the ground, you set up just a brood box, and in there you'll put some frames just empty, and you could also put a scent in there. There's products like Swarm Commander that people say works really well. You can get some lemongrass oil or put it in a little Ziploc bag and poke a few pinprick holes. So the lemongrass oil is close to the smell of a queen pheromone. So that's said to increase your chances of attracting bees to your bait hive. But generally, get some bees off somebody else, put them in your hive, and away you go.
Bones, he's asking a few questions, so we better answer a few of his. He wants to know, or she, would the bees pick and choose from their favourite flowers, strawberries, oranges, cloves, etc., or are you better off to separate the hives to get the different flavoured honey that you want?
So generally what happens is a bee in its lifespan will probably only go to one type of flower. That's because they only last 4 to 6 weeks, unless that flower source runs out, in which case they'll swap to a new flower source that's hopefully flowering in the area. So what happens then is you'll get a whole lot of your bees going to one flower source and filling up filling up, say this frame might be this coloured honey. Then that flower runs out, and then you might get out of the next frame this coloured honey, and you go, wow, look at that. So you really don't need to set up different hives to get the different honey flavours. The flow hive allows you to isolate different flavours just by tapping them into a jar. Some people like to put all their pipes and put some plumbing together and put it all into one bucket, but what that does is it mixes up all those flavours together, which to me, it's much more fun to have a lot of flavours. When people come to visit, you can go through that really enjoyable experience of tasting the flavours and talking about bees and so on.
Right. Just an answer to that question before, Cedar, Glenn came in and he said he's watched water dragons eat his bees. It was a great observation, and he's at Mount Ku-ring-gai.
Ah, water dragons, yes. Yeah. The water dragons will have a go and get your hive up off the ground a little bit and limit that. A few's okay, a lot's probably going to tax your hive a bit.
Few people asking about bee courses, Cedar, and some who are also doing the beekeeper.org course that we've got and really enjoying that. Maybe that's a good one to, other people are wondering if there are courses available and maybe they're not sure about our beekeeper.org.
Okay, there are bee courses available, and because we have probably half of people keeping flow hives are brand new to beekeeping, we've put a lot of energy into making educational videos, which you'll see, and also being here each week to answer live questions. However, we wanted to go a step further than that, and what we did is we created the beekeeper.org, where we have people from all around the world, experts from all around the world, making contributions to the beekeeper.org in order to make sure there's more than just me and my father as teachers here. And so you've got people like Hilary Kearney and Michael Bush and Fred Dunn and many more very experienced beekeepers from around the world, and they can add and teach what they've learnt about beekeeping. So it's a great program that takes you through step by step, and it's free to try if you want to have a go and see what it's all about. And we've put a lot of energy and a lot of time into making really good content in an order that's useful if you're starting from the start, to help you get started in beekeeping. And we've also made it a 50% of profits donated for habitat regeneration and protection. So the aim of it is to create a whole lot of funds that we can help the bees with, as well as educate, which also helps the bees. So it's part of our mission statement, is we want to help the bees in the world by supporting habitat regeneration and protection. So it's a program set up to do that twofold. If you're interested, go to thebeekeeper.org and check it out.
Nice. Estella Cook, she's wondering, we talk about the brood box being 80% full when you add the super. She's wondering, what does that actually look like? Okay,
so we put a super on this hive at the end there. If you dial back in our Facebook live feed, you'll see us two videos. One is titled something like, "Is your hive ready for a super?" And the next one is supering in flow hives. So those two videos will give you a good idea of when it's time to put on your super. But basically, you want all of the frames in the bottom box, which are conventional wood frames that the bees are using. You want to make sure they've finished adding their wax to all of those frames, building out all the combs, and when you open the lid, you can see a lot of bees on top as well. And that's the time to add your super. If you add it too early, what you're doing is probably just slowing down your bees a little bit by making it a bit harder for them to keep their brood nest warm. So the bees keep it at about body temperature, and they need to do that in order for their young to survive. They will do it even in an open cluster hanging in a tree without even a box around it. So they'll still be okay, but it's advisable, and it will help them a little bit if you wait till they've completed all the frames in the bottom box and there's lots of bees in there before adding your super.
Greg in Hawaii, he's just got his flow hive, so he's pretty happy. And he just wants to know, how much honey do you reckon you can get out of one flow frame when it's full?
So it's about 3 kilograms if a frame's nice and full. So that is just a little bit over 2 litres of honey. And so it's quite a lot actually. It's one of those big tall jars which you see us harvesting with sometimes. So if you want to harvest into a big jar, you can cover it up with something, go away and come back, but that jar must be at least 2 litres, otherwise you'll overflow that jar. And even then, sometimes you overflow a 2 litre jar. So, but the last bit comes out slowly, so you usually get time before that happens.
A lot of people asking about ants again, Cedar. I think you talked a little bit about this last week, but just wondering what's best to do for the ants. A few people recommending the cinnamon, the moats.
Yep.
Just wondering if there's anything else that would help prevent ants getting into the flow hive.
Okay, so what I tend to do is just add a little bit of grease to the leg here. In fact, we've done it on this hive. You can see it's a little bit, there's a little bit of grease here. So use a white grease like a Vaseline and just add it to the leg bolt of the flow hive too. You'll need to make sure the foliage isn't touching the hive, because if it's touching like that, then the ants will just crawl up the foliage. What that does is create a bit of an ant barrier and really deters them from coming up those legs. Other people like to make water baths for the legs to go in. You could do that if you want to. If you're having a real problem and the ants are quite persistent, throwing a bit of cinnamon behind the covers will be a deterrent as well. The ants don't particularly like cinnamon powder. So if they're making nests here and here. Now, having said that, ants aren't really an issue for your bees. Ants won't get inside your hive. The bees will really protect that area. So it's just a cosmetic issue. So it just gets annoying. You open it up and there's ants running everywhere. So that's the reason why you do it, just for that cosmetic issue. So you can just leave it as well.
Leah Lee is also asking, now I know I don't say this right, diatomaceous earth around the base maybe help control the ants?
I haven't tried diatomaceous earth, but what that is, it's actually ground up fossils, and diatomaceous earth feels like a smooth powder to us, but to insects it's incredibly sharp, and it gets in their leg joints and in their body parts, and it will actually kill insects. So my concern with using that, although it's a perfectly natural thing, is that perhaps your bees are getting really busy and they might get some of that on them as well. So you just want to make sure you put it in places where the bees can't access the diatomaceous earth, or you could be harming your bees as well.
Tina's asking, she wants to know, is it possible to have a hive? She's got a 20-acre farm plot, but she is in an area where other farms are using fertilisers and pesticides. Do you think she could still have a flow hive? She's got 20 acres.
Yes. So the answer is yes. I think most people are subject to issues of fertilisers and pesticides. Fertilisers won't be an issue because however, farmers are supposed to spray responsibly by using chemicals that have a shorter lasting time, and if they spray them in the evening when the bees have gone to bed, then they can do their work killing whatever pests they're trying to do, and by the next day, hopefully, then the activity's dropped of that chemicals. But can I say, will that get into your honey? Well, there's a possibility there. So generally, I think almost everyone is subject to those issues, to lesser or more degrees. We've got the cropping lands down here. So it's a matter of educating farmers, if they're spraying in the daytime and so on, to get them spraying, one, preferably not on flowers at all, and two, at times when bees are not foraging.
Great. Sorry, we lost out a little bit there, everyone. So we're back on again now. So Graham's wanting to know, his bees keep looking for water near the house, but he'd rather encourage them to a water source near the hive. Is there anything that maybe he could do?
Yes, and there's some great experiments that have been done by Fred Dunn. There's one called Bees Need Minerals, and the thing that will encourage bees to a water source is actually minerals in it. So a teaspoon of salt in a bottle of water will be more attractive to bees than fresh water. So, and that's often why you see them going for salty swimming pools, and it's why bees will go for mud or even cow pats over a nice clean water source, is because they need the minerals. They can't survive just on the nectar and pollen. They also need other minerals just as we do, so they get that when they suck up water. And if you make your water a little bit salty, then you're likely for the bees to go for that water source other than the other one at your house.
Betty Carr, she's got a beach plot in Thailand, lucky her, wondering if it'd work, with the flow hive work on a beach plot. She's also asking, will it ship to Thailand, and contact customer support for that one, Betty. I'm sure we can.
Yes, Thailand, a great spot for beekeeping, because it's a tropical region. You've got flowers all year round, and bees thrive in that environment because they can continue to forage. They don't have to shut down for a winter. What you'll find is you'll get ebbs and flows of honey. You'll get things flowering, and then you might get not much for 6 weeks, and then something else will flower, and then you'll see the frames filling up again, and then you get to harvest your beautiful honey. So we've got time for a couple more questions here, and today we just inserted this key a little way in order to harvest just a bit of honey. Looks like we're going to end up with more than a jar full. It's one thing you can do, is just harvest a small amount of honey rather than harvesting the whole frame if you're unsure if your bees are hungry or not. You do want to leave honey for the bees.
Riley Carey, he keeps asking, he wants to know, can you keep bumblebees in the flow hive?
No, bumblebees are what's called a solitary bee, which don't form a colony at all. So they just do what many animals do. They'll find a mate and lay some eggs in a small hole in the ground. I'm not exactly sure with bumblebees, and raise a few young and go on. They won't actually form a big colony like Apis mellifera, the European honeybee.
Couple more questions coming on. What kind of salt do you, when you talked before, Cedar, about the water, just iodized salt, or does it have to be Himalayan pink rock salt? I added that bit in myself.
Fred actually did experiments on that, and the bees didn't seem to care which salt it was. So you can probably save your pennies and go for any salt, sea salt, rock salt, whatever you want.
Okay. A couple of good shout outs to you and Stu for making such an awesome invention. That's pretty nice.
Thank you.
And then just people, I think a few more questions. Here's a good one. How do you clean the hive once you've harvested the honey? Do you need to clean up any of the wax?
No, is the answer. The bees do it all themselves inside the hive. So if you look at this side window, you might even see activity and see the bees starting to clean up the wax on the frames already. So if you look at this, this is the area of the frame we harvested, and this is non-harvested. And you can tell the difference because the capping here, which is the wax sheet the bees put over the honey when it's nice and ready to keep, and you can see it's lighter here and darker over in this region. So that's honey that's drained out beneath the capping. However, you can already see this bee down here chewing away at that capping, because they've already realised that the honey has drained out from beneath their feet. They're going to chew that wax away, and they will recycle it and use it in the hive. So there's nothing you need to do in terms of the wax on the frame. The bees will do all of that. They are so clever. And we've tried to design it so you don't have to think about it by putting this little cap at the back. When you put that back in, there's a little area just down here. If you look in the bottom of the flow frame, you see a little gap and you go, wow, their manufacturing wasn't very good, but it's actually there on purpose, where the last bit of honey, that because we probably don't want to stand around all day for the very last drips, will drain down to this end of the hive because your hive's on the slope, and then down that little gap back for the bees to reuse. And on this cap I've put little ridges, so there's a gap big enough for a bee tongue to get up into this area, and you'll actually get to witness that when you put the cap in. Have a close look and you'll see little tongues licking up into that area as the bees clean up the any remaining honey. Sometimes the bees will block that up over time, so you might come back to your hive at a later date and the honey's built up in this area. If it's been there a long time, you might need to clean that out. If it's been there a short time, just twist the cap around and that might unblock that little point at the bottom and allow the honey to go back into the hive. If that doesn't do it, you may need to pull this out and just poke a stick or something in that area to clean the wax out, allowing the honey to then drain out of this trough area back into the hive. Great questions. Thank you very much for tuning in. And if you do want to get a flow hive, we are still taking orders. We're making hives around the clock here. We've got plenty more on the water heading across to North America and also Europe, and we're obviously making them here in Australia and getting them out to people as well. So there's lots and lots of people wanting hives at the moment, so please be patient. We're making them just as fast as we can, but do get your order in soon, and that way you'll be able to get your hive sooner. Thank you very much for watching, and let us know what you'd like us to cover in a future live stream, and we can hopefully answer your questions so you can get started in what is an amazing, wonderful pursuit. If we look after the bees, they'll look after us, and the honey is this incredible thing we can share.